The Other Future is a show inspired by despair, actually, but hopefully bringing you the opposite. A lot of hope and places you can take a look to put your action, money, time in. The name The Other Future comes from my awareness that we had another future planned, maybe for millennia, of a lot of peace, lack of toil, sustainability, creativity, and since the 2016 election in the United States, in particular, it's become apparent that that future is being wiped off the horizon. There are a lot of people working against that, though, and for the future that we wanted. And I'm trying to shine a little light on those people and their actions to bring us there. Today, my guest is Al Gorman. Al is an artist living in Louisville, Kentucky, and he's doing some really interesting work. I look particularly at artists like Al because he's working somewhat outside of the gallery setting and outside of a lot of expectations for contemporary work. So,
yes,
how are you doing? I was just talking about next week's show, waiting for the call to come in. How are you doing this morning? I'm
doing fine. Yeah, looking forward to the talk.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background, just who you are, as an intro way into this?
Oh, sure. Well, I don't know how far back you want to go, but I self-identify as an artist. So wherever I am, that's one of the things that I have going for me. I grew up as a military brat, so I was born in Holland, and my dad is from New Jersey, of all places, but I've lived between the United States and Europe and found myself in Kentucky and have adopted that as my home state, and currently sitting in Louisville, Kentucky on a beautiful spring day.
That's excellent, man. I know you were...
And it's almost Derby time, as you know. So.
Right, of course. It's Louisville's Mardi Gras.
That's right. But as far as my education goes, formal education, I have a BFA in drawing from Murray State, an MFA in drawing from University of Cincinnati, and that's dabbled in a little study of science, too.
Oh, what in the way of science have you dabbled in?
Actually, I started off as a biology major before I ever went into art. And if I had been a better math student, I may have stuck with that.
Right.
As fate would have it.
Well, as an artist, what have you done? Because I want to get people up to what you're doing right now, which is really what fascinated me. Right.
Okay. Well, the kind of art I make now is certainly much different than what I was making in school, which was more traditional in its approach. I have an interest, like many people, in the environment. I don't know if I would go so far as to call myself a hardcore environmentalist. I'm just a contemporary human being trying to figure it out, too. But I work with materials that I find that have been born by the river and deposited in the Falls of the Ohio State Park, which is a tiny Indiana state park across from Louisville, Kentucky, in Clarksville, Indiana. And it's a kind of a unique environment, and a lot of my project is trying to interpret that kind of sense of place I get from this area. Right. And a lot of the materials that I use are plastic and styrofoam, driftwoods, some of the worst things. It's definitely not what I thought I would be making art from in art school at that time.
Right. Well, the Falls of the Ohio, let's start there. You're working on the Falls of the Ohio, and the Falls of the Ohio, they are one of or the biggest fossil bed in the United States.
Well, I think it's one of, but what it certainly is it's the largest exposure of Devonian-era fossil beds.
And that time period is Devonian.
Yeah, it is about 370 to 400 million years ago.
Right.
And that time period is best known for the appearance of fish.
So
first animals with backbones, the appearance of fish. But what we have preserved at the Falls of the Ohio are mostly marine organisms, fossil corals, some clams, those kinds of things. But it nevertheless represented the high point of life as it existed at that time.
Right. That's actually, I think you have two more periods that lead to the Mississippian, where that was a sea, right?
Mm-hmm.
That whole area.
Right. All the way up to the present and what some people are beginning to call the Anthropocene, right?
Yeah.
this other kind of extinction episode that we're having a hand in playing. But the Falls of the Ohio, the fossil beds there have been hundreds and hundreds of organisms that have been identified there, more so than at the Tapp site in Devon, England, which is kind of amazing. But for me as an artist, the Falls of the Ohio is a state park. In addition to being very conveniently located near my house, it's also a perfect platform for what I do. I'm standing on these ancient rocks that were the high point of life at that time, and I'm looking at a contemporary city on the near horizon and kind of musing about what all of that means.
Right. Well, let me get us to this. You were drawing mainly. That's where I met you, and you stopped drawing for the most part and moved on to these other things. Is that correct?
That's true. Although I would say that the influence of drawing is present in just about everything I do, because I think the chief benefit in drawing is learning how to see.
Exactly, and the works I saw of yours, they were gorgeous. I was curious to tie that into what you're doing now. So what you're doing now is wandering these fossil beds, and would you say sculpting or building, or how would you give
assembling, collecting, all of those things. I don't limit my activities when I'm there at the river. I'll engage in many different projects and different approaches to things. I feel that that's a place that I can be completely free as an artist, because all of my materials are worthless.
Yeah, right.
I can remember in undergraduate school trying to decide whether the last $5 I had was going to be spent on something to eat or a piece of paper.
I've been there.
And I don't have that kind of concern with the materials that I have now. But drawing, that whole eye-hand-brain connection, I think, is very, very important. And I'm on the fossil beds, but I'm mostly on the river bank and in the surrounding woods. It's about a 200-plus acre park. It's really quite tiny, but also among the history that I referenced and why it's such a great platform for me is that the whole Lewis and Clark expedition both began and ended there. William Clark was from the area, and most of the men that accompanied him out west were from this area as well. So, I mean, that's a big chunk of the mythology of this country, right?
Right.
It's the expedition to discover this new world kind of thing. But we also have John James Audubon,
right,
who's an artist I reference a lot as well, who actually the very first passenger pigeon he ever drew was at the Falls of the Ohio. He briefly was a storekeeper here in Louisville in the 1810s. So I reference all of that.
Audubon ties in really well with what you do. And let me say for those listening in real time on this, if you'd like more information or to take a look at Al's work, you can find that at Artist at Exit Zero. Zero is a numeral, not a word, not spelled out. .com, right? Or not org? Okay.
It's a WordPress blog.
Yeah, it's excellent. He's documenting his works. He's documenting his findings. But I see, like I was looking for when you were talking about having some dabbling in science, the tie-in with Audubon and his drawings, his watercolor renderings, and his ornithology. That, to me, is a lost tradition, because now, we don't have this requirement for depiction and observation in the arts. And so when you go to a lot of contemporary museums, you can see things that clearly people aren't, to me, they aren't invested in the process of making art in the same way.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I've observed that as well.
And there seems to be, it's like with reading, and perhaps this is just me, bemoaning.
You earn knowledge in a different way.
Yeah, and you look in a different way when you don't draw. So many scholars, I hate saying scholars because that references contemporary academia, but people that were curious and studied in previous ages drew all the time, from Leonardo to Audubon, and back to a lot of the medieval scholars. They were drawing. And
they were drawing, yeah.
Yeah, and it seems primal. There's something I want to get into as we talk about these, because you're talking about the Anthropocene and so forth. Because with drawing, one thing I loved about drawing was that when I am working with a piece of charcoal, that's just burnt wood and a binder, like some gum, basically, from a tree. There were people like me 50,000 years ago, maybe 100,000 years ago, sitting around a campfire looking for the correct piece of charcoal. And they're taking that charcoal and they're drawing. Mm-hmm. They're drawing on a wall. They're drawing on rocks. They're doing things, some of which have survived. So we know that they were doing this. They're probably doing many other things that didn't survive. But they were doing this. And I can see in the tiny fragment that so far has been human history, those people, humans or human-like creatures, making that mark onto a surface, all the way to me, some other sort of monkey in Kentucky at the time, or New York City, making a mark on paper, which is, again, just a fiber, just wood, basically, except a plant, and moving the same material. And then you come to you, standing on the banks of the Ohio, and
another monkey.
Yeah, another monkey, another creature, this biped, looking out over a construction from, as you said, a Devonian high point, and pondering, the potential for our idiotic demise.
Well, when you study evolution, and a lot of what you're talking about encompasses that, what the fossil record shows us are a record of creatures that came before us, and some of them were experiments,
right.
And whether sentience and intelligence were any advantage in life is kind of our challenge, whether it was any more advantageous than having a larger size wing or something,
Yes. This is WIOX, and you're listening to The Other Future. This is Terry Tapp, your host, and this is my guest today, Al Gorman. He's an artist in Kentucky. Yeah, exactly. David Bohm, the theorist, actually suggested that thinking was a maladaptive trait. We don't think most of the time. In fact, most of that energy we use in thinking seems to be directed to get us not to think, like to go on autopilot from a set of skills that we've internalized. And then we build on new skills by considering them, pondering them, testing them, then internalizing those, and so forth. But I don't think animals, for instance, like a hawk successfully grabbing prey or mating or taking care of its young, is weighing this out and taking notes. Like they're not doing what we're doing. And it's potentially our thinking, which we, as a group, seem to only be able to do successfully in the short term, that might be our demise. But go ahead. You were leading into that. I just want to add that tidbit that there are people who've considered that trait of thinking itself is maladaptive.
Well, I think it's very interesting, first of all, just to think about art making as a survival advantage. Because often you hear today, it's like, why are people involved in the arts? I mean, what does it do? We have such an emphasis on the whole STEM approach in education. But, if art didn't confer some survival advantage over deep time, even to the present, we wouldn't be involved with it. I really do kind of feel that much of our actions are kind of guided by behaviors that we have because we are animals.
Right. Of course.
I don't say that to be pejorative, or I just kind of feel that we are primates. So and there's a lot of other stuff that's happening that are conditioning us that I think about what my project at the river now, because the thesis I have developed over time was that we're trading our innate ability to be creators to become consumers instead.
Right.
And the stuff is flowing all around me.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I do hope people that are listening take a look at your website, because it's fascinating how Al will take, in case you don't have access to a computer at the moment, to get a visual reference, he will take discarded flip-flops and flip-flops that wash up in the tide,
From the river, Ohio River.
Right, exactly. And lighters, and what else? That's like containers of dishwashing fluid and things that have breezed along.
Plastic bottles, plastic balls, all kinds of toys, lots of styrofoam.
Yeah, that's odd. I've noticed a crazy amount of styrofoam, like the big,
probably
thick white
from
stuff.
boat docks.
Oh, that's right. So it would be chipped off when the boats are docking.
Maybe. A lot of floating wooden boat docks have a styrofoam support underneath them.
Right.
Yeah, I found a few over the years, and so that's, these huge blocks of styrofoam, which, to me is a material that is kind of very synonymous with us and kind of out of sync with nature.
Yeah, it's an odd alien thing. I worked with that years ago in some sculptures, and it was odd, and then it sticks, like any type of sculpting of it, it gets all over you. Like it won't actually get off. And I used some resins and binders on that, and it became this gooey mess that I couldn't extract myself from for a while. It gets under your fingernails. It's very different than clay, very different than metal.
Oh, very. I try not to actually form the styrofoam that I find to any great degree. I don't really carve into anything. I just essentially just poking holes and stuff.
Yeah, I noticed. Can you say more about that? Because you're making basically a zoology, like creatures and families, like living situations out of these styrofoam objects.
Well, it's all over the map, but I usually each year have an outdoor studio, maybe a few in the park, where I'll gather some materials, and anybody's welcome to use them if they find them. But I usually have stuff on display there out at the river, and these various projects. And the styrofoam pieces are interesting. One of the things that I try to do with my project is kind of meet the river at a halfway point. I think sometimes as artists, as people, we're overly exerting our will over everything, and I think in some cases, the materials, our art materials, can be that way as well. Especially what I do, where I'm still trying to allow a little bit of how nature formed and reacted to these materials to play through in what happens. And so what I'll find, everything from styrofoam to even coal will get polished, round and smooth by the river, almost in an attempt to humanize these materials in a way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was looking at some of the things that you've put together, and the polishing that's happening. It's interesting because as you talk about things like styrofoam and these plastic bottles and things, which don't get polished but get contaminated or altered by the dirt and the water. It's interesting to see, the larger forces of the natural world try to reclaim these things we've done.
I think so. I think nature has amazing recuperative powers. I think really one of the things we can do, I think, would be an effective strategy is just to take a generation off.
Yeah.
Just don't try to strive so hard. Just give nature a chance. Plant some trees.
There's the late psychedelic theorist Terence McKenna that was actually talking about doing something like what you said, not making any new things. I mean, of course, because of the crazies out there like artists, you've got artists which would have to make things, but not things in the way of mass-produced furniture or mass-produced, objects that are in your big box stores, and just reusing for an entire generation to break the consumerist chain for a moment, which.
Yeah, I don't know how else you can do it. I think, that's the conundrum walking the riverbank. It's like where does the switch turn on?
Right.
And how do we transition to something? I don't know if I'm that optimistic. I'd want to be, but everything I keep reading seems to suggest that things are happening faster for one than most believe. I think making art is a positive thing. So I'm going to go out there and keep trying to get people to connect with that. I think that's really also another big resource. I think people, once they realize, hey, I can be an artist too, or I can enjoy taking something that was nothing and turning it into something.
Right.
And but there's tremendous power in that, and I do think that we are trying to buy our way out of a lot of stuff, and it's just isn't happening.
Yeah, and I see what you're doing as a way of going into nature like artists like Audubon had done, and trying to confront it in some way and figure out your place in it. Because of it's interesting to me when I was mentioning that about the charcoal and its connection, and you mentioned the Anthropocene. Back in the 80s as a kid, well, partly as a kid and then, leaving the 80s as a young 20-something, I worried a lot about what I would do for paint after nuclear winter. Because we were very worried about nuclear war at the time. And that passed, as the 90s were going on with a lot of protests and a lot of policies, treaties, and the end of the Soviet Union, too. We put the nuclear threat on the back burner, meaning it wasn't quite the threat it had been, and now we've pushed it back to the front, unfortunately. But I read a lot about what would happen in a nuclear war, and being, like I said, this poor kid in Kentucky, I really struggled to get art supplies because I was working a number of jobs as a kid onward, and I wondered if there was a nuclear winter, where would I get good paint? So this idiotic thought, which is tells you how art overrides, I think, suggests how it overrides our survival instincts. To me, at least had this positive aspect, which was it's humanizing in the face of collapse. And I know, like many people, including myself, had problems, because of the financial collapse a decade ago. And I saw viscerally how art can sustain your humanity even through traumatic incidents or traumatic entire episodes, sections of your life. And I've talked to other people who've had that too. I wonder how artists view their experience of making art in the face of what looks like, though, as you said, we hope, and I'm hoping to shed some light on people trying to avoid it being an episode of environmental collapse and a social collapse as well as an economic collapse. We're still in this haze of unresolved issues, leading from the financial collapse of a decade ago. And we seem to be in a social collapse, an ongoing 40, 50-year social collapse because of, what you said with consumerism. That consumerism reduces you to basically, an id, and in the classic sense that Freud meant, an it, a bundle of desires waiting to be nurtured, rather than a rational agent or an agent of any sort.
And I do kind of feel the effect of all of that psychological warfare, through advertising, through marketing, through social media, so all of that, right?
Right.
I'm surprised I'm just not drooling in a Pavlovian way every time I see something that's a consumer item out in the world,
Right. And
how we
a
that
lot
far
of people,
behind.
yeah, well, a lot of the populace seems to be, given that people continue to, buy these things. So at some level, it's working, but it's completely dehumanizing. And I wonder, art to me didn't really have a chance to. We had you have basically a society in serfdom, like using Europe and the United States in the 19th century. And as we pass into the 20th, and you begin to have mass-produced art, which has serious drawbacks, but brings Mona Lisa, brings the works of Delacroix and things into people's homes, and at that point, advertising comes in. So the moment you could have a democratization of vision, maybe, or of your ear, through music, through albums and things, vinyl and cylinders, you simultaneously have a new manipulative force coming on where people are using that very vehicle to change you, so that you're not a free person experiencing these for the first time, but you are actually, in a new type of bondage. And as an artist, I'm curious, What do you think of that? Because as you're out there, your works are being not only subjected to natural forces, but people are giving you awards and attacking them. You're completely vulnerable as a parent, as a birther of things, of creations.
Well, that's a lot to chew on right there. Well, one of the things that I think what my project has been very good for me to do is at least just it's given me freedom to walk away from things.
Right.
To a certain extent, a lot of when I get back to the idea of being an environmentalist, I think when people get upset with my work, and occasionally it happens, mostly on Instagram, but it's because I don't pick up absolutely everything and recycle everything that I come in contact with. It is just the context is just overwhelming, right? And besides, one person on the side of the river. What needs to happen, at least with the plastic problems, that we need to stop making it.
Right.
And that kind of thing. But just being able to, I found personally very liberating in the art form that I'm practicing. Being able to sort of walk away and not feel the burden of that so much. Interestingly, too, what I feel like I'm doing is sort of rearranging the stuff that's already there.
Right.
What I'm doing is just trying to get people to look at it again, because I think an effect I've noticed is that people go down to the park and decry that they see all this litter, but then they stop seeing it. And what I do is kind of rearrange it and and put it in a different kind of. And it's one of the things that's sort of interesting as a test of an artist. And if I've done my job well, then whatever I've assembled, somebody else will take away.
Right. Let me give that URL real quick here. Since we're on the radio, if you buy a computer or want to see this work, you're not buy a computer and you want to write it down for later, you can look at Al's work at Artist at Exit Zero, and zero is a numeral. It's artist at exit0.com. Zero is a numeral and not written.
And the ad is spelled AT.
Right.
If I'd been smarter about that eons ago, which was a lot part of the learning curve for me, how do you stretch that digital analog divide?
I actually think the title's excellent. But, it is of course at Exit Zero, but at the same time, it has that kind of Sartrean existential
sounding.
Right.
Certainly, the landscape has changed tremendously, and here I am 200 years away from that event, and then what will it be like 200 years from now? So there's also a kind of historical aspect.
When did you start actually working on the falls? You started hiking the Falls of the Ohio.
Oh, yeah. As soon as I moved to Louisville in the late 80s, I've been visiting and fishing in the park and bird watching and all that kind of stuff, even before there was a state park. It's just now celebrating, I think it's 25th anniversary. But, I'd go down there all the time because it was always fascinating. It's just one of those little PowerPoints where a lot of energy happens. It's the only place along the whole 900 miles of the length of the Ohio River where you had to get out of your boat. So that's why Louisville is here. It's had thousands of years, of course, of human habitation around here. And so, I don't know, it just feels like the perfect thing for me. Plus, even though it's such a small park, because of the Internet, I can work extremely locally, but then send my stuff out there and, have conversations with artists, in New York or conversations with artists in Australia.
Right.
And that to me is fascinating.
Yeah, I've seen that. Comments put on some of the things you posted on Instagram that are. It's remarkable that we can have this kind of connection now.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, what have you noticed? Go ahead.
Well, one of the things I have noticed as a result of that is that most of the artists who are doing things similarly to me, whether it's just collecting ocean plastic or making art from the things that they collect, most of that effort is being directed along the coastline, around maritime environments. I'm like one of the few artists I can find working on a river.
So no one's directing their attention to the coastlines.
No, everyone's directing their
I'm sorry.
attention to the coastline. Yeah, it's the opposite. Everyone's directing their attention to the coastline, and people are not looking at the interior where all these rivers are.
Oh,
and all these waters are connected, right?
Yeah,
so
of course.
I'm finding material that, I'm living in Louisville, Ohio, but I'm finding material that originated north of Pittsburgh, even before there was an Ohio River, little rivers in Pennsylvania, and finding stuff that comes off the Kentucky River that flows into the Ohio at Carrollton, Kentucky. I mean, so it's been kind of fascinating, watching the whole drainage of the system.
Have you documented where items are coming from? Do you keep?
Oh yes. When I can. Interestingly, one of the things that the river does is it removes a lot of the labeling of stuff. So when I do an assemblage that's all these colorful plastic bottles, I don't take those labels off. The river did that, and so what it caused me to do is to see these things as forms instead of products.
Right. See, I was a barge worker for a while, shipyard worker, and I saw about 3 years. I saw when they had floods, major floods, bigger debris would float down the river, and you would see several times huge sculptures of trees, washing machines, basketball goals. It looked to me like the very first few years of the Planet of the Apes.
Right.
You had these giant constructions going down. I remember there was a washing machine, and 2 trees had gotten roped to it, but the trees had broken, or maybe it was 1 tree had roped, and it formed a cross, like an X. That's what it reminded me in the original Planet of the Apes, where you have the crosses. And it was enormous, though. It was bigger than the washing machine, and it was on what looked like a flatboat. But the flatboat had all types of objects, almost like someone had put this in place. It was kind of reminiscent of what you're doing, on the bed.
I remember one time finding a refrigerator up in a tree that it must have been 15 feet off the ground.
Wow. That's tremendous force.
And you forget that the river can get that high, and that this environment is that dynamic and complex.
Right. Well, and I know we're having obviously more and more flooding because of climate change, but there were reports of some of that from the 1937 flood in Kentucky of Ohio. I don't know if you've read up on what happened there at that time, but downtown Louisville flooded, and all
major event.
Yeah. They employed people from all over the state. In fact, my great papa came and worked on that. But so you've been out there like documenting it essentially for years. And what are you noticing in terms of climate change?
Well, that was very interesting to see. As a layperson, could I note anything? And I believe I have. Certainly, from the time I started this project to where I'm at now, there's been this tremendous increase in precipitation. That's how that's manifesting, how climate change is manifesting in our area.
Right.
There's all the, I suppose, all the water that's melting from these icebergs and glaciers and stuff. That water is going somewhere. And what I'm finding is a lot of it's precipitating out here in the Midwest, over in the Ohio Valley in particular. Last year, we set another record for precipitation. It's getting to where it doesn't really we don't have gentle rains as much anymore as we have weather events. Mm-hmm. When it rains, it's almost with monsoon intensity. Yeah. And so that, of course, leads to overwhelming our sewer systems and flooding and all kinds of other things. Here in Louisville, we're building these big catch basins just as a stopgap measure to collect water.
The catch basins, where are they building those? Along the river itself?
No, actually, throughout the city. I don't know if you recall where the old Jim Porter's Tavern was on Lexington here in Kentucky.
Right. That's
gone now, and behind it is this big reservoir that they're scooping out to hold storm waters, and because it's just overwhelming everything.
That's fascinating. I didn't know they're doing that. I saw on your blog where a number of places where you had built sculptures have been washed away or, suffered damage from the flooding.
Oh, yeah. It was really quite intense this year. I would have to say that, I didn't actually get much of an opportunity to interact with the river because it was so high. And, essentially the areas where I like to do my activity, do my art, were underwater for about 2 months.
Wow.
And the area that I specifically like to work in the park is called the willow habitat, these black willow trees, very stubborn and very tenacious trees. But they really took a beating this time. And the riverbank was altered, too. It kind of undercut the riverbank a little bit more. But another thing we have ongoing as well is on Christmas Day, we had 12 barges break loose, strike a bridge, and then get lodged against the dam at the Falls of the Ohio. Several of them sank. There was more than 12,000. Right? Sites again?
They were coal barges, right?
Coal barges, yes.
This is ironic.
Yeah, each barge holds about 1,500 tons of coal, so we had, 12 of them sink there, and they're still, it's an ongoing effort to not only remove the sunken barges, but the coal that was on them.
Wow.
I've already been finding coal, out there from that event, and it's already been shaped by the river. You can find big egg-shaped pieces of coal.
Already worn.
Already worn, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
If they're already worn, that tells you, or it would tell me that there's a lot of pressure coming through the river to wear them in that time. I know that kind of barge is a hopper barge. There's no cover to it. So,
right.
Yeah, so everything is just exposed and potentially coming up. That's crazy. So it's interesting to hear that something like that is going to affect what you're doing, because the coal, obviously, I would think that's going to come into your work now that, you as artist scavenger are digging.
Yeah, I already use it and have done a number of projects with coal over the years, but probably give me more opportunities is what I'm thinking. And the river is still kind of on the high side here, so it really hasn't gotten to its normal riverbank level for the season yet.
Right. Wow. I haven't lived in that area in over a decade, or about a decade, and I haven't been able to see those ongoing changes. But I spent a lot of time down on the banks of the Ohio, and and a little on the falls where you are, and I noticed it's interesting to see all the junk that comes up there, and to watch, like you said, the public is kind of inundated to it. They ignore it. Recognize that you're going to have plastic bags and tires and all types of debris. But the fascinating thing is, for an artist to come along and turn that into something that's part of the environment, that functions as something you have to notice rather than as background. What was the inspiration for you? Do the families, you call them the assembled, correct?
The assembly, in this case.
Right.
In some instances, many of these things are just too physically big for me to even remove off the riverbank. And I work for the most part by myself.
Right.
And when I can, which, a lot of, based upon what I posted, people think I live out there all the time. But if I can get out to the river, 3 times a month, that, usually just on the weekends, 3 or 4 times a month, then it's a good month.
Right.
But I'm extremely active when I'm there, walking through the landscape. I've developed a kind of ritual of where I walk, where I go look, and then I take advantage of what I find during that day and places that I might want to cite things. But it's every year is going to be different, and that's what I like about it's kind of a dynamic living kind of thing, and. But also, when you're working with these materials, I mean, it's very easy to turn people off. If I started browbeating people over the head with, the whole environmental message, then people, I think at this point, if they don't understand that this is happening, they don't want to know.
Yeah.
And so the trick is, how do you get people to want to engage this in some kind of way that they find maybe even entertaining or in some kind of way beautiful. Sometimes I wonder if all I'm engaged in is aestheticizing the trash that I find, but I'm trying to get people to kind of plug into the aesthetic a little bit, and maybe to see that, hey, if what he's doing I could do, then I'm all for that. I don't feel very proprietary about this work in that kind of way.
What are some of the responses the public's given you? I saw for myself there's a wide range of of what people have done with and commented on, how they've commented on your work. Can you say something about that?
Probably, on the more extreme range, there are people out in the world who are advocating, for a world without plastics, which I'm all for. But it might be one thing to be standing on a beach somewhere collecting teaspoons full of plastic.
Right.
When I'm dealing in a completely different context with all this macro plastic. And what I found is that people wanted to sort of turn me into their recycling savior.
So you're removing things according to this.
Right. Yeah, and as I say, probably more accurately, what I'm doing is just rearranging what's already there.
Right. Well, I
take a lot of stuff off. Don't take me. In fact, my poor suffering wife. Right. I drag a lot of this stuff home.
Yeah, I saw some photos of your studio. So you're not only assembling the debris the river is bringing, but you're also taking a bunch of it home to work on.
Oh yeah, and I've dropped a lot of it off into recycling centers too.
Yeah, sure.
Always a bag here and there. It's never just been about my work, right? So, but I don't know really. I'm at a point where I'm not sure really what gets recycled.
Right. Yeah.
And I want to believe that is a thing in the world, but I also kind of know that there's a lot of greenwashing that's happening. One piece that I did do, I don't know if you had a chance to see it, the Crying Indian.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, I mean, that to me was a really learning experience. I don't know if you remember that, what would they call those things, public service announcement, right?
Yeah.
This is from 1970, and nothing about that was right.
Yeah, it was very racist.
Very racist.
Yeah.
The guy wasn't even a real Indian. He was from Louisiana of Italian descent.
Right.
But interestingly, he did marry a Native woman, and they adopted a couple of kids. Well, apparently one turned out to be one of the foremost flautists in the world. Mm. So even though he came from a more racist tradition, he apparently once he got involved with the culture, was respectful to it.
Right.
But the piece that they did, the Crying Indian piece, which was created by Keep America Beautiful, which was another name for the container corporations of America.
Right.
They did some really interesting things in this little segment, and they tugged at people's heartstrings a lot too. Part of it, I think, had to do with the guilt we feel about what happened to the native inhabitants of this country. I think we bundled that into this in a very complex way. I don't know, just for your audience, I don't know if they recall seeing this piece, but it begins with the Native American paddling a canoe on a waterway, and there's trash all in the water. And it switched to a scene on the highway where cars are zipping by, and somebody throws a bag of trash out, and it splatters in front of this man's feet. And then he slowly pans to the camera, and there's a tear coming down his eye.
Right.
And it's still considered among the top 5 public service announcements of all time. The same group that created this also did "This Is Your Brain on Drugs" with the frying egg,
right,
and
right. Which was
Loose Lips Sink Ships,
right.
the McGruff the Crime Dog, the whole seatbelt campaign, Buckle Up for Safety. So this ad agency did this pro bono work for pro businesses for the most part. But one of the things that's interesting in this Crying Indian piece, of all the garbage that you see in this piece, the one thing you do not see is a plastic bottle.
Oh, I didn't notice that.
Yeah, and what prior to that, people may recall that there were recycling where you would bring back your used containers and you might get a little deposit on them. I mean, I know a lot of kids that earn candy money that way. But, after that, it all became about personal consumption, about, hey, it's your responsibility to deal with your trash, right? So now we don't have the manufacturers even dealing with the bottle anymore, right?
Yeah, this may or may not be the case now, but I know 5 or 6 years ago, a guy was talking to me down in the city, down in New York City, and he was very environmentally conscious, but he said, I don't recycle because in New York City, the recycling is shipped via truck to Indiana. And it's due, and I don't know if this is the case now, and I'm not sure how far it was the case then, but he seemed pretty up on his information. And it was a result of corruption and processing and transportation and all sorts of, graft and things like that. So, I know that goes on, and I know that's gone on for quite a while. But it's interesting to see how some people destroy your work when they see it, and some people give you makeshift awards.
Right. Guess I got a best of show once.
Yeah, right, best of show, which is fascinating because there's no show. And the fact there's no show, I love, because you're actually just walking into art. The art could be, another primate you're encountering in your journey. The art could be, a collection of other creatures coming up to you, but you're actually encountering it in vivo, in your natural environment.
And that's where I prefer to see this work. I know I'm a constant art insider, right? I've been working in galleries. I work in a museum now. And so I understand the whole context of display. And to me, to put my work into a normal kind of gallery exhibit kind of removes it from life, and that's the one thing that I don't like about traditional gallery context is that, it becomes too self-referential.
Right.
And, here's this object, and calling attention to itself in some kind of way. But so what I want to do is kind of the reverse of that, to kind of have people see everything else, in the place where it was created.
Right. Yeah, I saw
the context of life, right? It's in the context of life.
I saw where you had put work in shows and galleries and museums, as you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So you're bringing work, or you're bringing materials, if we call it that, home and working on them. Do you take those to the gallery and museum, or do you reintroduce them into the environment?
No. What I usually do is that most of the things, I would say 90% of what I make out of the river.
Right.
And really a lot of times what I'm looking for is to create an image, create a photograph, something that will, allow people maybe to suspend their disbelief about, say, a little creature I've made, or confuse people some way because you can't really tell what the scale of something is.
Right.
And play with a photograph. But I often, if I have a show coming up, and I do exhibitions so that I can continue the conversation I started at the river in another place. But if I have a birthday and I need a present, or if I've been asked by some not-for-profit, to contribute an artwork for a reason, then I'll take many of these pieces home and then I'll glue them up properly. What I do out at the river, I'm essentially just using little sharpened sticks. When I'm at the river, I have my only tools are I have a Swiss Army knife, my collecting bag, a walking stick, and then a camera.
Nice.
And I like to travel light like that.
And
I'll just walk through the landscape making stuff.
Well, do you consider? It's interesting to me because we now have these designations that seem to be more substantial than they used to be. Contemporary art, folk art, or outsider art, because you actually have these fairs, and so the fairs literally categorize things by putting.
Well, they're marketing terms.
Of course, exactly. But I wonder, one thing that attracted me to the kind of art that used to just simply be referenced as folk art and sometimes as outsider was it was art you would encounter on somebody's side of their barn. Growing up in rural Kentucky, in many ways, I was used to seeing constructions people would make. I hate calling them the front yard, but they're the part of their yard that's in front of the highway. These are old roads and things. It's not a neighborhood necessarily. And I was fascinated. You find people that decide to just put a lot of numbers on the side of an old shed, and the numbers have no reference. It's just it's kind of like when you get carving techniques that we see in ancient Egypt or Babylonia, and people just all of a sudden it hit them this epiphany that they can mark up things with language, or and they go a little nuts, putting it everywhere. And it's wonderful, but it's so different than, like, if you go to a lot of galleries in the city, in New York City right now, contemporary galleries, you'll see, if you look at the artist resumes, artists coming from RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, or artists coming from Yale, or artists from RISD, or Yale or RISD, and the work is largely vacuous because you're getting, work made for a market by the children of those who have economic privilege. To me, that folk category was a way of breaking through, because it's clearly a lot of the work that used to be designated as folk or outsider didn't seem to have commercial value until they discovered it in the late 80s. But it wasn't made for a market, and it wasn't something you could put in an advertising campaign. It actually kind of broke through to something potentially more human. And I see yours as, you can comment one way or another on this, but I see yours as coming in kind of in that that tunnel, so to speak.
Absolutely. I have been very influenced by folk art. I've collected it. I've had the pleasure of knowing several interesting artists that I've had, been able to even write about. One of them is Mark Anthony Mulligan. And you're right, the work would be, as an artist, as an academically trained artist, when I would encounter some of this work, it would be so surprising and so fresh and completely fascinating. And it was also very interesting to me that these people had a compulsion to make things, even though they didn't have any formal training, and that didn't stop them. And in some cases, I would say probably benefited them.
Right, especially with Mulligan.
Yeah, especially Mark Anthony. Yeah, what I love about his work, too, and a lot of what I try to do is create this kind of sense of place about where I'm at. And with Mark Anthony's work, and he's another individual would be great for your audience to check out, but when his work looks like Louisville. One of the things that I've noticed is that artists may live in a particular place for many, many years, but their work looks like it could have been made anywhere else.
Right.
And I'm always curious to know how that sense of place kind of creeps into the work, and think about that all the time on the riverbank. As far as my own work goes, because I'm also trying to not make a huge mess and not try to change the forms that I find too much to allow the river and nature to have more of a process in the making of this piece. But what results is that a lot of the things I make look like folk art, and that's kind of deliberate. I want people to think that, hey, I could have made this. I want people to, in some kind of way, rediscover their own innate artist. And because I think when people do, a light bulb goes over their head, and all of a sudden the world is a much more interesting and aesthetic kind of a place.
Yeah, I agree. I think that when you discover that you can create, you move from being an it to he or a she, or an agent, an actual person. Even if you don't choose to do it, just knowing you can alter the furniture of the world somewhat. We've only got like 2 minutes left. It looks 2 minutes. So I wanted to say, has anyone copied what you've done? Like you're working in this specific location, and you're assembling this debris, and playing with color and form, and doing something that's very, in certain times, very modern in the sense of modern art. Has anyone else, after seeing this, repeated it down the river or nearby or anything?
Well, I've had people kind of imitate what I do, which I applaud, because, it gets them involved with these materials, and hopefully, that in the process of working with their own creativity, they get excited about that. But I've had a few imitators and such, but that's okay. I mean, these are common items: cigarette lighters, flip flops,
Right.
whatever you can think to do with them. More power to you.
Oh, I was hoping, I wasn't using that pejoratively about imitation. I was hoping that maybe groups of people had assembled entire congregations of your assembled families and populations going down the Ohio, like a separate but mirror population made of styrofoam along the banks of the Ohio would be absolutely fantastic.